Good evening and welcome to The Report with me, John Rees. On tonight's programme, we report on the last day of the Chinese leader's visit to the UK. We'll also be examining the growing racial tension in Sweden after a man wielding a sword killed a pupil and a teacher in a town near Gothenburg. But first, we report on the situation in Iraq after the rescue of dozens of hostages under threat of execution by the Islamic State group. A US soldier was killed in the operation, the first since US strikes in Iraq restarted. Nathaniel Amos-Sansom has this report.
Early on Thursday morning, forces from Iraq and America are said to have launched a hostage rescue mission near the town of Fallujah in Iraq, reportedly saving over 70 people from the group Islamic State. The force was comprised mainly of Iraqi Peshmerga, along with US Special Operations Forces, who assisted in the rescue operation. One US soldier was said to have been wounded in the raid and later died of his injuries. At a press conference announcing the operation, the Pentagon downplayed the significance of the action in the conflict against the IS group in Iraq and Syria.
Bill, I would not... This was a unique circumstance in which very close partners of the United States made a specific request for our assistance, and there was a deliberate process to analyze this situation and the circumstances, and that's when the decision was made to move forward with this operation. There were a lot at risk here. This was a unique circumstance, a specific request from the Kurdistan Regional Government, and again, to thank the action of not only the Iraqi forces involved, but the U.S. forces. Lives were saved.
From the Pentagon, many are now wondering if America is beginning to go back in its policy not to get involved in direct fighting against the Islamic State group. With the conflict against the group stalled in Iraq and Syria, the US government seems to lack a clear policy on how to engage in the region.
Well, joining me on Skype to discuss this is Paul Schulte, who's Honorary Professor at the University of Birmingham. And on the line, Dr. Janet Harris, who's a lecturer at Cardiff University and a former BBC journalist. Welcome to the programme, both of you. Paul, the Pentagon are making efforts there in that clip to play this down, to say that it's a one-off operation. So although this kind of thing appeals to some sections of the press, would you say that there's...
Difficult to tell. Some of the commentary one's picking up in the media is that Obama and his team are prepared to do this kind of thing, sensitive to criticism that America is not doing enough, that just engaging by air power is inadequate, and that some efforts on the ground will be needed. So you can read it as a willingness to move in that direction, subject to anxieties about mission creep and denunciations of getting drawn into meat grinders. So I think it's probably a very unusual opportunity, rare intelligence, impending execution of a large number of people, together with a relaxation of America and anxiety about keeping their troops completely withdrawn from the fray.
So, Janet, a possible toe in the water or not?
Well, I think one should. I mean, there are about 3,500 troops, if not more, American troops in Iraq anyway, who are doing this advise and assist that the military is doing. And I mean, from reports that I saw, they were saying that there were some special forces sort of hiding behind walls, watching what was happening, and it looked as though the Peshmerga were coming to come under increased fire, and so they moved in to help. Now, I think the military always says the plan survives first contact with the enemy. Whether they got involved because they thought they had to, whether it was part of a greater strategic plan, I don't know. But also, I think much of this war is being fought in the media, and it is, as John was saying, it's a great statement to be able to make, especially in the face of the Russian involvement in Syria, to say, look, here we are, we're actually doing something in Iraq.
What do you make of the reports from Kurdish intelligence that only 17 people were rescued, not the States are claimed. Is there any way we can make a judgment about that?
No.
Janet?
No, I absolutely agree. I don't think we can. And again, I think, an interesting. It's part of the tribe there is pretty. It's part of the old, Jaburi tribe is quite pro. The part of the awakening, pretty anti IS. Plus, if they are, so they might be unwilling or afraid to come forward. Especially another thing that's interesting is how involved were the popular mobilization units, the Shia, who are in that region as well. That hasn't been reported. I mean, that would be interesting with the involvement of the Peshmerga.
Mm. So Paul, even on this operation itself, shorn of any wider consideration, missing pieces, the degree to which the Kurds were involved, were they under pressure simply in a battlefield situation? Other forces that Janet was suggesting, quite a lot we still don't know.
No, but there are some interesting indications of what we do know. The Kurds have pointedly disclosed that the Iraqi government was not informed. This was something done by the Peshmerga so-called special forces, who seem to be somewhat better trained by the Americans for a counterterrorism role. And it's done between them and American trainers and advisors. It's done by Kurds with Americans without telling the Iraqi government to rescue a group of people who turn out to be entirely Arab. Now, whether they knew they were entirely Arab, whether that would have made any difference is not clear, but it's evidently in the way that it's being spun, increasing the special Kurdish role and the prominence the Kurds have as America's most combative allies. So in terms of the future relations, emerging relations between the Kurdish government and the Baghdad authorities, this is an indicator the Kurds are continuing to take more autonomous control, which they will expect to be conceded further.
Janet, do you take that view that the Kurds are now benefiting from this?
Yes, I do. I mean, it was quite interesting to see. There were rumours of talks between the Kurds and the Popular Mobilization Unit, the committee. So again, they're obviously playing quite a deep game as to allying themselves in the region. I think absolutely it's going to be interesting to see what happens next.
Paul, just widening the frame of this that hasn't got the same amount of media coverage was the retaking of the Baja oil refinery recently. Should we be paying more attention to that?
Well, it's worth noting, it's encouraging, but it's part of the very slow clearing operations for the eventually planned advance on Mosul. I think the refinery was not operating because it had been bombarded. So it isn't going to deprive ISIL of revenue in the way that other refineries might, but it's showing that there is a slow movement north, and so that's good. It's part of a desperately overdue narrative of clearance of northern Iraq.
Do you think that does indicate that that process is now, after being trailed for many, many months, underway?
Yes, I mean it's a strategic move that they are making to sort of on the way up to Mosul and Ramadi. But I think it's also quite interesting that all these oil places. I mean Baji was incredibly infiltrated by IS. Years ago, Al Qaeda was making massive corruption in that area. So it's going to be interesting, even though they've taken the land, they've taken the terrain. Whether they still manage to whether it's cleared, thoroughly. As I say, because even when the Iraqi government held that land before, the money that the corrupt that was happening in Baji and was immense.
So, Janet, just sort of pulling back to the widest possible picture now, if you had to summarise what the kind of balance of forces is now between the Islamic State and its opponents in Iraq, how would you summarise it?
Sorry, me?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I think again you have to watch out and see what Abadi is doing and the Shia are doing. I mean, one of the big fears is that, you know, once an area is cleared and the Shia or the Badr Brigade, especially the Popular Mobilization units are around, is what happens to the Sunnis who are there. And I think, you know, it's like the awakening. If they lose that, if the Sunnis feel whoever's there that they're going to be that they're not going to be secure, then IS can come back again. You know, this is not. It doesn't mean that you've taken a place that you can.
Paul, your view of the overall balance now?
It's hard to tell because it's not just about numbers, it's not just about weapons. It's to do with rather intangible things like morale and determination. And nobody is able to measure that very well. It's clear that the ISIS offensives have been stopped. It's clear that there is some limited movement against them gaining ground from government and coalition forces. How long that lasts and what the ISIS response might be, they could counterattack, is very hard to tell. But Janet makes a very good point. The coalition forces, the Iraqi government in particular, has this extraordinarily difficult problem. It needs to make sure that when it retakes ground, and it must retake ground to be seen as credible, that it detects and eliminates ISIS operatives and sympathizers who might otherwise go underground and just come out again. But if it does that too brutally, if it does it by unleashing Shia sectarian forces in a way that people who've appeared on your channel, Sunnis, have said is kind of unbearably provocative, if it continues to do that, if it does indeed do that, then it irrevocably loses Sunni support and stokes up invisible background assistance for ISIS. So we should be aware there's an extraordinarily difficult balancing activity going on in all kinds of places where we don't have reports, and it's not going to be apparent what the outcome for hearts and minds will be for months or maybe years.
Janet, in terms of a wider strategy of defeating the Islamic State, do the major powers have anything in place? I mean, state, but is in existence for a considerable period of time, has, as all reports say, its own internal revenue raising structures now. Are there other things other than either bombing it or fighting it that the West could productively be doing to undermine it?
Blimey. Well, I think it would go back to what John said. It's about the hearts and minds in many ways, and I think that you know, if people feel insecure, if there is no help that is seen to the Iraqi government to counter the sort of the Shia influence, then you know, it's like basic counterinsurgency. If you don't will the win of the people, then you've lost the war.
And Paul, one last question: are there things that could be done, non-military things that could be done that aren't being done?
Well, some are being done, but it's not apparent how successfully. The building up of the Iraqi government's capacity, the way it can actually meet demands for services, famously electricity, which is still in short supply, but education, health, all those things that civilized societies expect in a kind of non-corrupt and more or less efficient way. The more it can do that, the better chance it has of outcompeting ISIS. And also there's the propaganda war, which is partly an Iraqi concern, but it's actually an international concern. Dealing with the extraordinary claims about some kind of paradisical caliphate that's being created in Raqqa and beyond, and responding to the extremely prolific and professional propaganda, especially pours out of Islamic State and its sympathizers around the world. So that kind of digital electronic battle space is important. Attention is being given to it more and more, but exactly what the balance of success is, like a lot else in this campaign, is not apparent. It's murky. Only time and history will tell.
Okay, Paul Schulte and Janet Harris, thanks very much for that conversation. But it's all we've got time for on that topic. We'll be taking a short break now, but when we come back, we'll have a roundup of today's main news headlines, and we'll be taking a look at what you've been saying on social media. That's after this break.